Fights are pretty common in the world of sports. When you have hyper-competitive athletes trying to tear each other down to hopefully climb their way to a world championship, you're bound to see some tempers flare, resulting in a few extracurricular activities. But oddly enough, as common as this is in traditional sports, we rarely see it in the world of competitive gaming. Esports can get pretty heated with trash talk, online flame, and frustrating game-ruining experiences, but as much as players may lose their cool online, we rarely see things get physical in person. Maybe that's due to the nature of esports, where players play behind monitors rather than face-to-face, but whatever the reason, of all the things competitive gaming borrows from the world of traditional athletic competition, this doesn't seem to be one of them. But that doesn't mean that fights have never happened. Back in 2011, a fight broke out between teammates at a premier League of Legends event. These guys were some of the most talented players on one of the most legendary teams in the game's early competitive history, and although their scuffle wasn't a super big deal in the moment, it would mark the end of one of the most successful teams League had seen up until that point. This is the story of Against All Authority. This story begins on September 22, 2010, when the French esports organization Against All Authority formed a League of Legends team. Oddly enough, although AAA were entirely new to League, they were able to build one of the most talented rosters Season 1 would ever see, comprised of 6 total players, many of whom you probably know. Soaz and Yellowstar, for instance, started their careers here, where these guys have become household names in the League esports scene since, as their time with Against All Authority was just the beginning of decade-long careers. Even today, they're still working as players or coaches, just recently reuniting on the Olympic Lyonnais sponsored team LDLC. Other players on this original roster, though, you may not know quite as well, like Titus or Moma, who were solo queue gods that always topped the competitive ladder of early seasons, but who never got to shine so brightly in the LCS era. But for all the talent and personality this team had, the 2 signings that had the most weight behind them probably had to be their jungle and support players, Linak and Kuja. Kuja was a sort of face of the franchise, kind of like a French version of Ocelot, in that he was AAA's charismatic personality that was always put in front of the camera. He'd appear in promotional videos or do interviews to always try and get the team's name out there. In-game, he played support and functioned as the team's main shot caller, a pretty advanced structure for the time, as most League teams didn't bother assigning a designated leader in this sort of way. But not only was he the captain in-game, he also functioned as a sort of team manager outside the game as well. Kuja was really the one who brokered a lot of the business deals, finding sponsorships, and representing the team when it came to any sort of managerial aspects of running an esports organization. He sort of became the de facto leader of the squad, but if he was the team's face, then Linak had to be the team's heart. Linak, who mained jungle, was nothing but raw talent, and might have just been the best star Against All Authority had rostered. He was rank 1 on the European solo queue ladder for a really long time, back when EU was merged in a single server rather than split into East and West like what we have today. This was also at a time when the only active servers were North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia, meaning that you could very well argue Linak was the best League of Legends player in the world, full stop. This guy could take junglers that nobody was looking at the time, like Xin Zhao for example, and make them look like the champion was broken with how well he used them to pick apart an enemy. Tons of other pros, especially junglers, really looked up to him for how knowledgeable and talented he was at League.
No, I don't know what this guy's doing. I don't know, Linux just lost. Oh my god, I gotta do it! Oh my god! Oh my god, Linux the hero! Oh my god! No! Wow, I thought he was going crazy, but it turns out he was just Linux is outwitting me as well. Wow, that ball is a steal. Like, Linak balls just dropped all over bottom lane.
There was one problem I have to mention about Linak, though. He was really toxic. It seemed like everyone in high elo on the European server had a story about him ruining one of their games. For example, there used to be this player named Guardsman Bob that was an early League of Legends streamer from Denmark who got pretty high rated on the European ladder in League's first 2 seasons, even though he was someone that was a bit more focused on being a content creator rather than a pro. This guy was one of the more wholesome personalities in the scene in that he was always smiling with a happy, positive face, which we all know how difficult it can be to remain positive while playing solo queue. Seeing him rise up the ranks among Europe's best was a really nice thing that a lot of people in the League community liked to see, but Linak, on the other hand, did not like Bob at all. Anytime they were ever put on the same team together in solo queue, Linak would allegedly do various jerkish things to try and troll him, like selecting the champion Bob hovered or setting him up to fail and then asking teammates to report him, all because he thought Bob was just a bad player. In spite of how toxic he may have been, Linak was happily welcomed into the AAA team as their star player, since he really was one of the best players in the world, even if he could have a nasty side. And with this superstar lineup, Against All Authority crushed the early online tournament scene. Most of League's tournaments back then were weekly online events like the Go for LOL series, where most of the big-name teams in League competed. AAA was one of the 3 teams in Europe that usually traded titles back and forth, the other 2 being SK Gaming and OSK, a sister team to SK Gaming who eventually moved to My Revenge before ending up at Fnatic. All 3 of these teams frequently clashed in online events, as well as at one of the very first offline European events to ever occur, the IEM Season 5 League of Legends Invitational, which had a pretty interesting structure. Only 4 teams were in attendance, the big 3 and Dignitas EU, so rather than have a traditional playoff bracket, the event just had 2 group stage phases. In Phase 1, all teams would play best of ones in a single round robin against each other, where the top 3 would then move to Phase 2. Here in Phase 2, the second and third place team from Phase 1 would play a best of one, with the loser then playing against the first seed. Finally, the 2 remaining victors would play a final best of 1 series to determine who was the champion and who got second place. When all was said and done, Against All Authority finished second this tournament, only losing twice to My Revenge, once in each phase. This was slightly disappointing for them, as they had managed to easily beat that squad in plenty of online events prior to this, but second place is still an impressive result, and afterward the team looked to take their talent back home to France, where they continued steamrolling online events. Before long, they would manage to do so well in the League tournament scene that AAA was invited to the European qualifier for the Season 1 World Championship, the biggest tournament that League had seen up until that point. Not only that, but they were also given the number 2 seed for the EU qualifiers, only behind SK Gaming because of how dominant their recent online success had been. That Season 1 qualifier went insanely well for Against All Authority as they continued their incredibly dominant streak. They would start off by beating ALS before managing to topple both Fnatic and Gamed to win the whole event, getting the number 1 seed from Europe for the Season 1 World Championship. This was really exciting for them since they had managed to beat the other 2 teams who would also be representing Europe at Worlds, and seeing as many people believe that EU could very well be the best region in the world at the time, you could make the argument that AAA was the best team from the best region and possibly favorites to win League's first World Championship. At Season 1 Worlds, Against All Authority started off the event with a kind of tough loss to the North American squad Epic Gamer. This was a ragtag group of players who famously didn't practice much or scrimmage together in preparation for events, but who still managed to win tournaments off the individual talent of their solo queue stars. It was a tough loss for AAA as they looked pretty weak against Epic, but NA in general did really well in this group stage, finishing at the top of both groups, so maybe they just had something on Europe. Against All Authority seemingly redeemed themselves, proving their talent by beating Fnatic and Pacific Esports to get second in Group A. This then placed them into the playoff bracket, where AAA started off by breezing past the German squad Gamed before running into TSM. As well as they had done in the tournament up until this point, now was when things started getting much bleaker after they lost a Game 1 of the set, where they had to pretty much play from behind the entirety of the match. Game 2 looked like it was about to be more of the same, as Against All Authority were facing the potential of being knocked into losers bracket, as TSM had an 11 kill to 6 lead at the 30-minute mark. Things were looking pretty dire, but AAA managed to steady themselves from here on out. They wouldn't fall any further behind than what they already were, and as they successfully dragged the game out longer and longer, that 4K gold lead TSM had meant less and less. They might technically still be losing, but at this point in the game, everyone had all their key items, and if they just had one good team fight, they could easily bring this series back. Then, at the 50-minute mark, AAA did this.
What's gonna happen here? AAA are actually going into the forest of TSM. And did TSM spot this? Yes. No, they did not. They don't have any wards there. They have no idea that currently AAA is behind them in the forest.
I don't know if they're going to initiate on the fight here. You see Aurelia coming in strong. They're taking a lot of damage from Corki. Wow! Corki doing so much damage. Yellow Star able to put out that DPS and a lot falling. It's going to be KX going down to the ground. One of the tankier characters right now. The odd one falling. Not looking good for TSM in this fight. Great focus coming out of the hands.
Wow, they could take the next one. Wow, Regiment falls here and Regiment is going to fall here. That's game. That's game right here.
This match was significant in that it was a really clutch win for a team that mostly had only performed well when playing at online events. They never really shown this level of collectiveness at a LAN before, but here they were playing from behind all match and managed to keep calm for 50 minutes to sneak in a win, keeping the series alive. In the third and final game of the set, AAA took their momentum and turned it into a victory that would be one of the cleanest wins they got all series, playing from ahead this time, where they finished with a 16-5 kill victory that took them into the semi-final. Here they'd be matched up against Fnatic, the team they had beaten in groups and in qualifiers to make it this far. All they had to do was get a few more victories and they would be the Season 1 World Champions. Against all the odds, it was Fnatic, the number 3 seed from Europe, who went 1-2 in their group and who just lost to AAA in their 2 most recent meetings, that were the ones who emerged as victors, sweeping the French squad in the winners finals and beating them again in grand finals to get League's first ever world championship. It was a shock and something that must have been pretty disappointing for Against All Authority, but then again, a second place finish is still really impressive, certainly finishing as the second best team in the world at League's biggest tournament would establish them as a top team for the future of competitive League of Legends, right? Well, apparently not. Just 2 days after the Season 1 finals, the players of Against All Authority would leave to join a new organization named Millennium. This was a really big shock to the League of Legends community since nobody really knew what was going on or why. The team's roster was sticking together, but to have the second best team in the world change orgs just 48 hours after they were in grand finals was really weird. Some French fans worried about the stability of both organizations, while others allege Millennium must have offered some pretty big cash incentives to make the move happen. AAA put out a somewhat sarcastic headline saying, "Second is not first, so we fired them," while then making their frustrations known in a detailed article venting about how they wanted to keep the team, but apparently the players left after Kuja met with Bjoran, the Millennium manager at the time, in Marseille. Back then, it was pretty normal for teams in esports to change organizations somewhat frequently. Hell, Fnatic's roster had changed orgs twice before settling on where they were, so this swap didn't necessarily spell doom and gloom for these French superstars, but sadly, it would prove to be the beginning of the end of this talented team. With the roster now sponsored as Millennium, the squad seemed to pick up where they left off at first, continuing to enter Go for LOL events online, where they did fairly well, but a few cracks were now starting to show in their structure as the team continued struggling at offline events. At IEM Season 6 Cologne, Millennium kicked off the event well, getting out of group stage with victories against fellow European teams, and even started off the playoffs by getting a victory against CLG, but they would lose to both CLG and Fnatic before getting eliminated in 4th place. The next event was IEM Season 6 Global Challenge Guangzhou, where this was a significant event in LoL's history as it was the first international event held in China. Millennium made the trek across the globe trying to make France proud, but again would manage to come up short, this time getting eliminated in group stage after losses to CLG and Team WE. This was starting to get frustrating for the squad. They still had some of the best individual talents in League of Legends history up until that point. There was no discernible reason that they should be doing so well at online events while struggling to close out matches at LANs. It was almost becoming a bit of a curse that started hovering over the team and seemed to sow some discord between its members. Around this time, rumors began circulating that inter-team feuds were starting to happen, mostly focused around either Kuja or Linak. These are only community rumors from about 8 years ago, let me be clear, but people started discussing mumblings of MoMA leaving AAA a while back because of some sort of difficulties he had with Linak, which wouldn't be surprising considering his past. Other rumors circulated surrounding how the rest of the team was avoiding Kuja for one reason or another. Millennium's roster would continue performing poorly until one day they decided to finally part, going their separate ways. Kuja would go off to start his own separate squad, leaving all the players' futures in limbo, but seemingly right when the players were about to split up, there was a reason for them to all come back together again. The World Cyber Games, otherwise known as WCG, was the self-described Olympics of gaming, an esports event that was structured around rostering teams based on what nation they were from rather than what esports organization they belonged to. League of Legends had a pretty rich history with WCG, seeing as the very first competitive event LoL ever had was run through the World Cyber Games just a year ago, so everyone was pretty hyped for the 2011 edition of the circuit. Because most esports teams rostered players from plenty of different nations, most of the competitors who wanted to enter WCG had to create new separate national teams just for this event with some pretty dramatic roster shifts, but Millennium were interesting in that they didn't have to do that. Ever since MoMA left the squad, they were all French nationals who could enter together, and because of this, Kuja agreed to rejoin the team for the sake of this one final hurrah. On day one, when group stage began, Millennium had a pretty mixed bag of results as they would lose to the Korean representatives as well as a Malaysian team, which was pretty disappointing, although they would beat future Season 2 champions, the Taipei Assassins, as well as a team representing Sweden, which let them escape groups and gave them qualification to the playoff bracket afterward. When all was said and done, day one of this event went pretty well, but that was when everything blew up. Shortly after group stage concluded, rumors started floating around that two of the players from Team France got into a fist fight. This was reported by Absolute Legends to the English community, which, oddly enough, not many people really cared or paid attention to it. When this was posted on Reddit, a few people made jokes about how it was similar to the 2010 French national team's blow up at the World Cup, but it didn't really get too much focus. Before long, nobody seemed to remember it, other than the occasional pro player who might make reference to what happened in a tweet. However, the French League of Legends community really loved this juicy bit of drama. Against All Authority would actually write an entire article detailing what happened at the event, which I'll read a few Google translated excerpts from. This was on day one of WCG when the League of Legends French national team were hanging along the Counter-Strike 1.6 team from France in the hotel lobby of the place they were staying at. A remark, however not very witty, of one of the LoL players towards one of his teammates broke a camel's back, which had to accumulate from a good number of disputes. A ridiculous exchange of blows ensued, right in the middle of the hotel lobby and in front of about 50 people. One of the protagonists grabs a butter knife from a nearby cafe and advises the other not to turn his back. In this situation, we take our Samsungs and we film while giggling. Fortunately, there are men, real ones, in this case Rara, to put an end to the scuffle. Conclusion, a black eye, beautiful anecdotes to tell Absolute Legends, a forced reconciliation by the French delegation, and a video of the confrontation. So this obviously gives us a bit more insight into what actually happened. Apparently, Kuja and Linak got into a fight in the hotel lobby, which resulted in Kuja giving Linak a black eye. The scuffle concluded when Counter-Strike player Rara stepped in, and afterward, things seemed to return to normal pretty quickly. Some of the footage we saw later on at WCG showed the team getting along just fine, so this oddly might have not been the biggest deal, and honestly, I don't really know how to feel about it. On the one hand, Linak was a pretty toxic guy in League. He was constantly ruining games for his teammates in solo queue and continued ruining games pretty much the entirety of his early League career, which we'll get into more in a bit. It must have been pretty nice to see a bit of retribution for him to end up on the opposite side of a rough confrontation, as if he was getting his just desserts. We all have our own stories about how frustrated teammates in League of Legends can make us. I mean, imagine how good it would feel if you got to take a shot at some jerk who was constantly ruining your games. But on the other hand, I kind of feel bad for Linak here. Millennium made a pretty big deal out of this whole event in an almost rude way. Later on, when the CS and League teams were together on a bus, either heading to the airport to go back to France or maybe just traveling to WCG itself, someone would film a vlog that included a big close-up of Linak and his bruise, which he obviously doesn't look too happy about. Come to think of it, in most of the footage I've seen of him, Linak doesn't really look like he's having that much fun being a League pro. I mean, maybe this is just something he didn't enjoy all that much, which could be why he was found to be a bit irritable sometimes. Following group stage, Millennium continued playing through the rest of their matches at WCG without much of a hitch, although their performance did begin to suffer from here on out. In bracket, they would win a series in the quarterfinals against the Singaporean team Flash Esports 2-1, which did put them in the semifinals against North American representatives Chixdig Elo. Here though, they would lose a 2-0 series that wasn't all that close, which eliminated them from a shot at the championship and instead placed them in the 3rd place match. There they would face off against CLG Canada, where they would lose 2-0 again, finishing the event in 4th place. Following WCG, the team would finally split up, going their separate ways, which they probably hoped would serve as a new opportunity with a potentially bright future heading into seasons 2 and 3, but would ultimately end in disappointment for most of them. Kuja actually stayed at Millennium, revamping the entire roster, bringing in fresh players with the hopes of building something new, but sadly this new team wouldn't ever reach that same level of talent and success as the original squad. They struggled at most events, getting last place in a few of them, and sometimes failed to win even a single match in tournament group stages. Kuja would then leave Millennium and try and join a few other teams in the hopes of qualifying for the EULCS when official regular season leagues began for League of Legends in 2013. He came really close, making it to the offline qualifiers twice, once in the spring of 2013 and once in the following 2014 promotion, but sadly his team would just narrowly fall short at both events. In that 2014 qualifier in particular, he and his team Salade Tomate Oignon were only narrowly eliminated. They got knocked out in a really close group stage that determined which challenger teams would get to fight the incoming demoted EULCS squads for a spot in the following split. That relegated LCS class was really weak, with only one of their teams re-qualifying in a full best-of-5 set, meaning Kuja could have probably made it back to the LCS if he just won one more game in this group. After falling just short though, Kuja seemingly retired from League of Legends and competitive play. The rest of that old Millennium roster actually stuck together for a while, going back to AAA, bringing MoMA back to mid lane, and signing N-Rated to be their new support, which was honestly a really talented roster that got a lot of League fans hyped when they saw it. In spite of all the ups and downs these players had had over the years, they were still some of the best pros out there in terms of their raw skill and had loads of potential. This Against All Authority roster would have more success than Millennium did, even managing to beat them in a few events where they clashed, like the IEM Season 6 World Championship, but they too wouldn't ever take first place at a major event. After a few years of middling success, some of the players would leave to go on to bigger and better careers, Soaz off to join Fnatic and Yellowstar off to SK Gaming, but Linak actually stayed behind with AAA, trying to qualify for the EULCS in the 2013 spring split. Against All Authority would make it to the offline qualifying promotional series, but right before before the event began, Riot Games announced that Linak would be banned from competitive play for a year. Apparently, he had continued being incredibly toxic in his solo queue games, getting permabanned on one account, then having his behavior worsen, then getting reported in 20% of his total matches with another permanent ban on his main. Because of all of this, Riot would suspend Linak from the Season 3 European qualifier as well as all EULCS competition for 1 year. His ban would then be extended by a year due to not improving his toxic behavior during that period of ineligibility. AAA managed to replace Linak with a jungler named Virtual, who did help them to successfully qualify for the EULCS in 2013, although funnily enough, he would also get banned by Riot for quote-unquote several cases of bad behavior. In retrospect, I honestly think this was just a really sad fall from grace for this team. I mean, personally, Against All Authority was one of my favorite teams to watch in Seasons 1 and 2, and I always hoped they would get their form back from their glory days in the years that followed that Season 1 championship. Some of their players obviously went on to have great successful careers, but I just wish everyone got to join them. I guess not everybody can find happiness through the endless grind of League of Legends. We all know how frustrated and crazy this game can make you. I mean, that's not exactly an excuse to literally fight one of your teammates or to be so toxic in-game you get multiple accounts banned, but I think all League players can relate to some of the frustrations these dudes felt. No matter what happens next though, their accomplishments will always be a part of League of Legends history. This is a squad that had a very important place in shaping this game's competitive scene. I just hope that wherever these guys are today, all these players are happy. Thanks for watching.